Okay, so moving right along here with our study of post-colonial writers. Next, we're going to take a look at Derek Walcott, who self-described himself as a mulatto of style. And with that term mulatto, the reason why he used that to describe himself, he is really a combination of influences and factors. He grew up on the island in the Caribbean of St. Lucia, and that island has one of the most complex histories, particularly colonial histories. And um, really, the people living there are just a combination of factors influence their development as a people. And so that's why he gave himself this title. And he's responsible for composing Omeros, which is one of the most um, influential pieces of post colonial literature. Its achievement as a poem is is I would argue not only one of the biggest um, achievements in poetry of the 20th century, but of all time. We're going to look at some short excerpts from Omeros in our textbook, but if you've taken my intro to poetry class or you've sat and read the whole thing, it is its complexity, its length, everything. It is probably the most complex narrative poem ever written. So let's learn a little bit more about Walcott, and then we'll take a look at Omeros. Like I said, he was born on the island of St. Lucia in the British West Indies, and that's a largely Roman Catholic society. So his upbringing was very religious, and we'll see how that influences the poetry. He attended school at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and then lived and worked in Trinidad as a book reviewer, art critic, and playwright before really getting into his own writing of poetry. From the early 80s on, he taught at colleges in the US, but primarily Boston University. He wrote Omeros in 1990 and then won the Nobel Prize in 92. He'd been writing pretty powerful and influential short lyric poems, some of which are in the textbook, for quite a long time, and hadn't won the Nobel Prize. But then he wrote Omeros, and it was such a poetical achievement. Like I said, 2 years later, they said, "All right, Walcott, we'll give you the Nobel Prize." Um, Going back to what I was saying about the combination of factors, he has split allegiances to African, Caribbean, and European heritages. So we'll continue to talk about that more, but he self describes, these are his words, his background as schizophrenic. He calls himself a mongrel, and a mulatto of style. And so these are all indicative of the fact that he's got this complicated, intermixed background, and so do many of the people born in St. Lucia. His grandmothers were of African descent, and his grandfathers were of European descent, a Dutchman and an Englishman. All of this background, and then growing up on an island in the Caribbean. So I think you see where the titles he gives himself that I mentioned in the previous bullet point, where those come from. To complicate things even more, St. Lucia traded hands 14 times in colonial wars between British and French. And so the French were the first to colonize St. Lucia, but the British tried to take it from the French, and they fought over St. Lucia 14 times. Well, they fought over it lots of times, but it actually traded hands, where it went from being a French colony to being a British colony 14 times. And so this just further, complicates the history of everyone and the lives of everyone living there. Furthermore, on this, the official language, it was the last um, British colony to achieve independence that I know of. It achieved independence in 1979, about 10 years before Walcott finished writing Omeros. So he was writing for much of his career before St. Lucia received independence from the British. But after independence, English is the standard language, again, proving Rushdie's point. But people don't really speak English that much because the French were there for so long and controlled it for so long. French Creole, which is also called patois, is what people most commonly speak. And Walcott knows both among a number of other languages. And to go along with everything we talked about with Rushdie in the previous section of this lecture, Walcott has a the textbook says a paradoxical hatred of the British Empire, but a love of the English language, which is true for most post-colonial writers, especially since they've chosen to write in English, but to try to challenge and critique um, the flaws and problems with the British Empire. So I want to give you a little bit of background on Omeros. Like I said, it's a long narrative epic poem written in the style of the Iliad or the Odyssey. And it's not quite as long as those, but it's still very long, several hundred pages. But it's, I would argue, much more complex. In terms of long narrative poems, I don't think I've ever read one this complex. There's layer upon layer here to reflect that complicated colonial history I just went over on the last slide. And so Walcott wrote this long narrative poem where he gave it layer upon layer of context and allusion to show to readers how complicated the colonial history of St. Lucia is. Um, the title Omeros is a Creole rendering of the name Homer, and what he really does here is transpose elements of the Homeric epics to the Caribbean. And so, similar to what Joyce did with Ulysses, and Walcott is a huge Joyce fan, Walcott does here once again with the stories from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Um, The language of it is mainly written in English, but he combines West Indian English, Standard English, and French patois. And so West Indian English is English, but it's English that's been influenced by um, the languages of the West Indies within the Caribbean. And so you have, for many of the countries, India, Nigeria, other African countries, St. Lucia, other countries in the West Indies or the Caribbean, you have versions of English different from standard English that have been influenced by the local languages. And so it's very similar to what we saw in the Achebe story with the mixed in Nigerian Pidgin. So you have that type of English, you have just your standard English, and then you have lines of the poem that are also in the French patois. If you read this poem, as you'll see in the textbook, if you read the whole poem, I think you'll see that despite this mixing of languages, enough of it is in standard English. It's fairly easy to read. It's difficult to interpret, and you really have to spend a lot of time reading it, but it's well worth it, and it's not that difficult to just read. And if you're able to download good footnotes off the internet, then there's not too much French in it. It's pretty easy. It's often you can find notes online that translate that for you. And if you are ever interested in reading it, I have a really good collection of footnotes that make it easier to read. I can send you. Just let me know. Also, there's the rhyme structure of the poem is terza rima, which Dante invented for the Divine Comedy. Um, and that's a poetic rhyme structure that's not used that often. And so he's specifically channeling the most epic writers from a variety of countries, right? Here you've got ancient Greece. Now you've got medieval Italian here, but along with the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, specifically the Inferno, is considered one of the greatest epic poems of all time. So Walcott's making as many um, significant literary allusions within the genre of the epic as he can to elevate the status of his poem in the lives of the characters in it, much the way Joyce does in Ulysses. So here are some of the characters. The one that's primarily depicted in the passages we have in our anthology is Philoctetes, who's a variation of the character from the Iliad, Philoctetes, who, just like Philoctetes in Omeros, has a wound. I believe in the Iliad, it's been a long time since I've read the Iliad front to back. The sections of it I've read more recently don't contain Philoctetes, but my memory is that his wound, I don't know if it heals at some point, but he's left on this island by his comrades when his wound doesn't initially heal, and then the gods make them go back and get him so that he can fight in the war. And so the wound is what's really important and symbolic with the character Philoctetes. The two main characters from the poem who we don't really see in the selections in our textbook are Achille, which is a version of Achilles, and Hector, from the Iliad. Um, all three of these characters, Philoctetes, Achille, and Hector, drive canoes as their business. That's what they do for a living. They take tourists around in canoes. But there's a love triangle between Achille, Hector, and then Helen. And so Helen represents the island because Achille and Hector are fighting over her. And so Walcott's drawing on the imagery and symbolism from the Iliad here. And, with Achille alluding to Achilles representing the Greeks, Hector alluding to Hector representing the Trojans, and then Helen, the name being the name of the woman who was part of the impetus for the Trojan War. She's a woman who's known in literary history for having two sides in a war fighting over her, essentially. And so she represents the island in the poem of St. Lucia and its colonial history with Britain and France fighting over it is the ideal. There's a really important part in the story where Achille travels to the underworld, where he travels beneath the ocean. And this recalls the scenes from the Odyssey with Odysseus and then the Aeneid with Aeneas by Virgil from Roman mythology, where the protagonists travel to the underworld and visit people who have been long dead there. And so there's a scene toward the middle of it where Achille is traveling in this canoe. He has heat stroke from the sun and he's kind of floating on the canoe and he passes out. And then in his dream or reverie, whatever you want to call it, he travels beneath the ocean and there he meets his African ancestors, including his father. And this is really important. We talked about how Walcott grew up on the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, but had this African heritage. And so what happened is when the French first colonized St. Lucia, they committed genocide and wiped out the indigenous inhabitants. And to our knowledge, it's really tragic, but to our knowledge, there are no of the original indigenous inhabitants of St. Lucia left in the world. But these were French slave traders who did this, and they brought with them slaves from Africa and then populated the island with African slaves. And so the, in quotes, indigenous or native population who lived there for centuries as the British and French were fighting over the island were actually people brought there from Africa, forcibly brought there from Africa by the French, who were not the original inhabitants. And so this makes life and culture for anyone from St. Lucia very complicated. It's not just colonialism, it's this history. And so there's a sense of guilt that I think Walcott would argue pervades the heart of every St. Lucian person. And it's not really their fault, but you at the same time, you can't easily escape it by saying it's not my fault. And so as Achille travels beneath the water and meets his African ancestors, there's this huge, you could say, kind of purging of guilt, an important experience that the character achieves. That I think Walcott was, in writing this in part to St. Lucian people, was, trying to help them work through this and process this part of their history. So one of the most complex colonial histories of any country, Walcott tries to do it justice by creating what is really the most complex poem, the uber poem of uber poems, the most uber poem of uber poems. This is a poem, let me tell you. And so let's take a look. Now that you have all this background, a lot of these things here don't even happen in the parts we have in our textbook, but I wanted to give you their other characters, Irish characters I don't even go into here, but I wanted to give you as much as I could to help you interpret it. Okay, so we have these short stanzas that are 3 lines following Dante's Terza Rima. And here we have the first description in our textbook of Philoctetes' wound. He believed the swelling came from the chained ankles of his grandfathers, or else why was there no cure? That the cross he carried was not only the anchor's, but that of his race. for a village black and poor as the pigs that rooted in its burning garbage, then were hooked on the anchors of the abattoir. So, as they're driving the canoes, Philoctetes receives this wound from an anchor, and so it's related to his occupation, the wound is. And he drives the canoes with tourists in them. That's how Achille, Hector, and Philoctetes make their income. And in the opening um, chapter, there's this great line that says the tourists take his soul with their cameras as they take pictures. And that's just wonderful because St. Lucia in the Caribbean is this beautiful place. It's this beautiful place. And so I've never been there, but I've seen pictures of it. And so following um, colonization has become like this resort town. And the beauty of it, the resort town where tourists go, that all belies the deeply tragic colonial history we just talked about. And so there's a critique here of kind of the touristy culture surrounding St. Lucia. And Philoctetes' wound, he receives that as part of that experience, driving tourists around in the canoe. It comes from the canoe's anchor. And so his wound comes to represent much more. It comes from the chained ankles of his grandfathers. Remember, everyone here is a descendant of, of, of slaves from Africa. And so the wound, what the wound represents is colonial experience, colonialism, imperialism, slavery. That's what the wound represents. And so Walcott uses the symbolism of Philoctetes' wound and extrapolates it out. And so it's everyone is wounded here. Everyone who's a native to St. Lucia is wounded here by the colonial experience and their own history that was forced upon them by the African slavers. Um, and so that's why the wound is so important, and I think why the editors of the textbook chose these parts of Amoros to include in the textbook. Um, Going on, we have the passages where the wound starts to be healed. The bow leapt back to the palm of a warrior, the yoke of the wrong name lifted from its shoulders. His muscles loosened like those of a brown river that was dammed with silt and then silkens its boulders with refreshing strength. His ribs thudded like a horse, cantering on a beach that burst into full gallop. So the healing of Philoctetes' wound heals the whole island like a baptism. Um, There's a part in the poem. Again, to understand these, I have to kind of bring in context from other parts of the poem since we don't have the full thing in our textbook, where Walcott himself is one of the main characters. A writer, a poet, much like Walcott, is one of the main characters. And it has to do with creation here. Walcott put so much energy and effort into composing this complex poem, he almost has to put himself in there to give some commentary. And toward the end of the poem, this is very near the end, there's only 7 books. And so this healing of the wound is happening in book 6. In book 7, there's a part of the poem, I should say, where the Walcott character, the poet character, goes on a journey and visits other countries. And then in book 7, right at the end, he releases the creative control of the poem to nature. Nature and the environment are huge themes throughout this poem, and you have this bird flying around that kind of represents that. And so he gives up that freedom. But I think you see some of that here. That's why I bring it up. His ribs thudded like a horse, cantering on a beach that burst into full gallop. You have, this is right after, the stanza before this is where it says, Philoctetes' wound is healed, and it asks the question, what else did it heal? Then you have this stanza. So there's this release of burden as the wound is healed, where people are freed to a certain extent from the colonial experience. You also have Achille returning from his visit to the underworld around this time. So people are freed to a certain extent from the colonial experience and from the guilt perhaps they may have felt about what the French did to the native inhabitants. So this release is, represented here with kind of the turning loose of nature, the bursting into full gallop, and the unrestrained nature, I guess, is the way you could say that. And so all of these things, the healing of the wound, Ashiel returning from the underworld, Walcott returning from his journey and releasing um, the creative trajectory of the poem to its natural course, him relinquishing control of it, that all is meant to be emblematic of some of the healing that takes place, the how poetry, how literature helps achieve some healing for the colonial experience, and that's portrayed here at the end of the poem by this unleashing of nature. Um, Moving on here, we see the last lines in the selection we have. And why God pissed on the village for months of rain, but now quite clearly the tears trickled down his face, like rainwater down a cracked carafe from Chusul, as he stood like a boy in his bath with the first clays. Innocent prick, so she threw Adam a towel. In the yard was Eden, and its light the first days. Um, so one of the keys to understanding this poem is the idea of new life. Um, Healing a Philoctetes wound, as I mentioned on the last slide, is often depicted as a baptism. You can see right here he's in this bath of water. And what baptism for Christians represents is a new life. Why it's so important that Christians go through that experience of baptism is it's symbolic of death to their old sinful life and rebirth in Christ. So baptism represents new life. Also, in the larger context of the poem, beyond the scene, you have Helen gives birth to a baby. And so the baby obviously represents new life. And then in the final lines here, you have, in the yard was Eden. She threw Adam a towel, and the yard was Eden. So you have the idea of the garden. And as I mentioned, Walcott's upbringing, this is primarily Roman Catholic society on St. Lucia. And so Walcott's upbringing was primarily religious, and so he would have been very familiar with the Bible. As I was saying, Walcott, growing up with a religious background, would be very familiar with the concept from the Bible of the new heavens and the new earth. What this means is if you read the Bible and you look at Revelation, the last book of the Bible, heaven is very different from the way it's often depicted culturally. People think of heaven, these floating clouds, right? But it's actually, there's a vision in Revelation of heaven, the heavens coming down to earth and the two meeting and forming what the Bible calls the new heavens and the new earth, which is basically a new, updated version, but very similar to the Garden of Eden from the beginning of the Bible, now without sin, with no snake entering it. So when you read here, so she threw Adam a towel, in the yard was Eden, and its light the first days. I think what Walcott's doing there is evoking the new heavens and the new earth and creating a new Eden, a second Eden, which is really what heaven is in the Bible here, through the healing of Philoctetes' wound. And so we'll talk more about that on the last slide. Continuing on with what we just said, birth or creation or new life is the key to understanding this poem. Helen gives birth to a child, which is a new life, but she does not know if the father is Ashiel or Hector. This represents hybridity. Hybridity is a term often used in post-colonial studies to describe a connection between two things, which so often, as we talked about, comes up in post-colonial literature. Post-colonial literature is all about the mixing of things, the mixing of cultures, of identities. Hybridity is a word that signifies that. So with the struggle over Helen, the men fighting over her, Achille and Hector, that represents Britain and France fighting over the island. Her child represents a new life, but a life forged out of the post-colonial experience. A life that is a mixture of things rather than a single thing. This represents how in a post-colonial culture, post-colonial life, one cannot simply return to the old life, pre-colonization. So you have a new life, born out of the combining of cultures. And this um, is what Walcott creates with the poetry, a new creation. When you reach the decolonized, the post-colonial point in the history of a country, you can't return to the old way of life. Colonization is over. What do you have now? You need a new creation. You need something entirely new to sustain what is now an entirely new existence, but shaped by a long and sordid history. And so Walcott does that through the poem here. You have the new baby with its complicated history representing that. To go back to that, finish out the thought on that new heavens and new earth idea, this is the kind of paradise Walcott creates. Um, you have the juxtaposition of the touristy false paradise with a real paradise. Um, the new heavens and the new earth, as I just explained them, are the perfect metaphor because it's not the same garden from the opening of the Bible. It's a new garden, but a more perfect one. And the previous one is corrupted by sin. And so this is similar to you have really Walcott here doing something that Rushdie pointed out he also does, using the Christian fall as a metaphor to represent colonization. So you'd have the original garden, which is pure before the fall, colonization representing the fall, and then a new garden emerges post colonization, but the new garden is not the same garden as before. It's a new creation, um, a better creation, but it's not the same one, even though it's a paradise in its own way. So really, this biblical story is the perfect metaphor for Walcott and Rushdie and writers like them to describe what needs to happen, what they believe needs to happen through literature to help post-colonial people move forward, to forge a new idea out of the history of colonialism for post-colonial people. And what is interesting then is similar to Rushdie's discussion of the appropriation of the English language, because here you have a Western religious idea that's not necessarily part of the colonized culture, but you have the post-colonial writers appropriating it, reworking it for their own purposes as a metaphor for what is necessary after colonization. A new identity born out of the history, the complicated history, but a new one nonetheless to forge forward. And so ultimately, this is positive. This is hopeful, which I think is a good thing. You also have something very hopeful in the Achebe story with the character of Jonathan. And so these are some of the tactics post-colonial writers have used to grapple with the long, complicated history and most importantly, move forward like you see with new life here in Omeros.